During one of my recent sit reps, I mentioned the idea that the US dollar and, by extension, government systems and all financial systems are underpinned by violence. Since then, I received a number of questions and people asking me to clarify this point. So I thought I'd take this time to explain what my philosophical standpoint is on this and why I believe that violence is the fundament that underpins our society. Violence is golden. Now, this is a term that comes from an essay written by a man called Jack Donovan, an author who I highly recommend people read, especially if you are a man. Now, in that essay, he more eloquently states all the theories that I'm going to go through today. So I recommend having a look at that. But what I'm talking about today are my beliefs on the matter, and they come from my perspective as somebody who has experienced an extremity of this type of violence, being war. Now, I'm not saying that violence is good. I'm also not saying that violence is necessarily bad. What I am saying is that violence is. It is a fundamental part of the human animal's nature, our nature. Denying it, repressing it, ignoring it, or punishing it, I don't think is going to do anything to actually make it go away. Violence exists. As Jack Donovan put it, violence is not the only answer, but it is the final answer. The truth of the matter is this: without at least the looming threat of violence, none of our society could exist. Everything we do is leveraged off that fundamental principle. Without the threat of consequence, extreme and sometimes life-ending consequence, there would be total anarchy. As the Romans would say, si vis pacem parabellum. To secure peace, prepare for war. Now, this is as true for societies as it is for individuals. What prevents a country coming into another country and enforcing their will is the threat that the invaded country can, through violent means, defend itself, aka a defense force. Likewise, what stops an individual from taking everything from another individual is the threat of consequence, usually through the mechanism of law and police. And this, I believe, is what prevents the majority of crime in our society, the threat of violence. But that same mechanism not only helps secure peace, it can easily, and quite often is, used to enforce the will of the governing body against its people. This is tyranny. If you disagree with me on this, then just stop paying your taxes. See what happens. I mean, first you will be financially penalized, something akin to sanctions. If you still refuse, then you'll be ordered to court. If you still refuse, at some point, the police, those same people that were set to protect you, will kick in your front door, push you to the ground, arrest you, handcuff you, drag you out of your home, and then you will be detained and incarcerated for a period of time of their choosing, against your will. That is violence. But of course, this is how the system of law works, and I agree with you that we have laws for a reason and they do need to be enforced. But in this aforementioned example that I just gave, what violence did we commit in order to necessitate such a violent reaction? We simply did not pay an arbitrary levy. Maybe, but I would ask you this: would you voluntarily give money to the government? Would you voluntarily give $10,000 to the government every time you sold your house? Would you voluntarily give the government $2,000 if you sold your car to your friend? Would you give $1 extra to the government for every $10 that you spent on any goods and service within our country? Would you also, depending on how much you earn, give $4 of your dollars out of every $10 that your hard effort earns to the government? Now, would you voluntarily do that? If you say yes, you would, well, congratulations, you're a communist. But most sane, rational people would not voluntarily give their time and efforts up so easily, especially when it's so often spent on protecting and insulating companies and sectors and the government themselves from the effects that the rest of us have to deal with. Now, the reason we pay taxes is because it is underpinned by violence. It is my opinion that to the extent that we can actually measure how free a people are from tyranny from their own government is directly correlated to the disparity between the ability of violence of the people versus the mechanism that the government uses to control, i.e. the police or the military. To put this in layman's terms, how overmatched in firepower are you from your government? Or, to put this another way, the government has a total monopoly on violence. In the US, for example, most states still allow their citizenry the right to bear arms, even semi-automatic rifles. You can argue whether that's right or wrong. That's not the point here. They do that. So that disparity between the people and the government is lessened. In Australia, however, we have a very lengthy and costly process to get a license. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing. But when we get the license, we are restricted in the type of weaponry we can actually own. We can own bolt action rifles with a magazine no bigger than 10 rounds in capacity. Pistols are extremely restricted, and body armor is illegal. Now, by comparison, if we look at the police that walk our streets, they have body armor, semi-automatic pistols, tasers, batons, pepper spray, and sometimes even fully automatic assault rifles. The disparity in the capability of violence is displayed clearly for all to see, and the message is clear. You are overmatched. Now, this might not be a problem for you. You might say, that's great. I leverage off that ability of violence of someone else in order to be, or at least feel, safe. And to a certain extent, that's true. However, as I stated before, the problem arises when that mechanism that is set up to protect us is used against the people for the will of the governing body. Allowing people the freedom to say what they want and to gather in public in order to do that. Allowing people the freedom of movement around their own country. Even allowing people to leave their own homes might be inconvenient for a government that's worried mainly about optics and polls, but for the individuals of that society, it should be an inherent right. The utilization of violence against its own people is the definition of tyrannical behavior. So this is what I mean when I say that violence underpins our society. It is the bedrock in which our society is formed. And like any survival principle, it behooves us to take control of it in our own lives. As much as possible, I encourage people to retain agency over their own lives, to retain the choice on how you live your life. To this end, I think it's not just a right, but it is actually a responsibility of us as human animals to expand our ability to be violent. As we've seen in the recent floods and in the bushfires before that, we can't rely on our government to be there for us. Likewise, in a violent encounter, we can't always rely on the police to be there for us, especially if it is a widespread emergency event. Ultimately, the responsibility for the well-being and survival of ourselves and of our loved ones falls on us. And as such, we need to be ready to respond to life-threatening situations. Just like securing food or water or shelter, cultivating our own inherent ability towards violence helps secure us and our future generations against the threat of tyranny, both foreign and domestic. Violence matters. Semper Paratus.